If you're of a certain age, then there's at least one time in your life that you played that classic video game Duck Hunt. I don't know why, but I just feel like I need to make some sort of artwork to pay homage to this thing. And it wouldn't be the first time that I've made some scroll saw work based off of a video game. But first, I need a template. I took multiple screenshots of the game and I pieced together different aspects of it to form a scene. Then it was a lot of line work. I drew a bunch of squares and rectangles and basically just pieced everything together to figure out what I'm gonna cut and what I'm gonna keep. After way too much time sitting at a computer, I came up with my template. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it's gonna do. And as far as the background goes, well, I'm not gonna do blue. Instead, I'm gonna go with maple. I want something light so the colors pop off the scene. This maple board is thin. It's actually really, really thin. I took several boards, glued them together to sand it smooth, and it's gonna be a good background for us. Now, I'm gonna take some contact paper and stick it onto my background. That'll make it way easier to clean up things later on. Then I'll spray the back of my template with spray adhesive and stick it onto the contact paper. Now I like to try to align one of the edges of the template to one of the straight edges on my workpiece. That makes it a little bit easier whenever I'm gonna trim this whole thing down to final size later on. Some people put clear packing tape over the top of their templates. I often use a magnifying glass that has an LED light, and sometimes I can put some glare on my work surface if I have packing tape on it, so oftentimes I'll leave that off. I drilled a pilot hole in my workpiece and then I got to work. Now I'm gonna use a crown tooth blade for probably most of this, and as far as the size goes, I'll probably jump around from 0, 2, 3, 5, I don't know. I kinda don't know what blade I'm gonna use until I'm in the moment. And it really depends on the species that I'm cutting at any given time and the thickness of that species. I want my artwork to have that 8-bit look with the pixels and the simple colors and all of that. So I drew a lot of blocks whenever I made the template, but I'm not beholden to that. I want to be flexible. Certain areas I may cut a little bit bigger. Certain areas I may cut smaller. Whatever. It doesn't have to be a mirror copy. Again, it's just an homage. I had to stop several times during the process to make sure I was cutting the right area. I have to keep the background, but cut through all the pretty parts, like the trees, the dog, the grass, the ducks, all that kind of stuff. And there's some areas where the sky's kind of peeking through those objects, so I'm trying my best not to cut through those by accident. I got my background cut out, and I've got a whole bunch of offcuts. Those will be important to save. We're definitely gonna need those later. Now, next step is I need to take that background, I need to glue it onto this. This is a piece of MDF with some veneer glued on top of it. Earlier I cut some Wingate and cherry veneer and glued it onto each side of this MDF. The Wingate is gonna be the dark background, the shadows, the negative space of my artwork. But if you glue something on one side of a panel, you should glue something on the other side so it's balanced out. Helps to prevent it so it doesn't warp and twist on you. That's where the cherry veneer comes into play. If this whole process looks complex or expensive, it's not really. I bought a large roll of veneer that's lasted me for years. So when you add it all up, it comes out to less than $5 for this whole thing. I'm using a roller to spread the glue evenly across the whole back of this background. The thing is I don't want to put too much glue. I just need a really thin, even coverage, because if I put too much, then that means I'm gonna get a lot of squeeze out. And then what's the point in cutting out all these crazy shapes if it's just filled with glue that I'm gonna have to scrape out anyway? So don't need to go crazy with the glue. Also, like I said, with this panel, I had to glue something on the front and the back, right? That's why I have this. This is a piece of poplar, just flimsy piece of poplar that I glued up. That's gonna be for my back panel. I'm using Titebond Extend, but I probably should have used my veneering glue. Titebond's fine, but it took a while to spread the glue around because of these complex shapes, all these little areas that I have on this picture. Basically, the glue started drying a little bit too quickly for me, so I had to keep adding glue here and there. I also wasn't really thinking about it. I should have trimmed down my panels before I glued them to the MDF, but oh well, it didn't impact the project in any negative way. Hey, that doesn't look too bad. Kind of a cool silhouette. So where do we start with something like this? Pretty much anywhere, right? I don't know. I'm thinking the dog. No particular reason. Just seems like a cool place to start. So to do that, I milled up some Osage or orange wood. You can see my board's more yellow than orange. That's because I just milled it up. If you compare it to some of these other pieces I have, these are offcuts from previous projects, you see how orange they are. And my board will turn that way. It just needs some time to have those UV rays hit it for a bit. So I'm not sweating it. I can go ahead and use it now. It'll darken up later. Just like before, I'm gonna put some contact paper on my workpiece and then use spray adhesive to stick my template onto it, and then head over to the scroll saw, get to work. The pixels are giving this project a unique challenge. Usually I could just use my offcuts to align all my pieces. In this case though, I had to make so many 90-degree cuts that I either had to cut the background or cut up my pieces. I couldn't really keep both. That means my offcuts are a little bit too sloppy to use for alignment purposes, and that means I had to make extra offcuts. Fresh offcuts? Piping hot fresh offcuts. That's what we'll call them. Basically, I just took a piece of poplar and I stuck a template on there and I recut out the entire dog and ducks and all of that stuff so it fits into my project. And the sole purpose of that is to be a sacrificial lamb. So I can cut out little pieces, glue my pieces in, and just keep chipping away at it. If you notice, the dog has a red outside border for shadow. I'm gonna use some bloodwood for that one. The pieces I picked out are slightly thinner than the rest of the dog. It's gonna provide a little bit of depth to the picture. These are the tiny details that you may not think really matter, but whenever the whole thing's done, it provides a big impact. There are a few areas where I need to add the background between the objects, like around the dog's face. These pieces were too fragile to hold up when I originally glued the background onto the MDF. Some of the pieces broke, and then there's others that are still connected to the offcuts that I saved for later. I'll add those back to the artwork as I work on each section. I'm always trying to find a balance between if I'm going to use the shadows, the negative space for the dark areas of the artwork, versus cutting out a piece from a piece of actual like dark wood. Now I've been thinking it over. I think I'm going to use some ebony for the dog's ears and the ducks. Ebony's expensive, so I like to keep my scraps, even the small pieces, and I store them in a plastic bag, dump it out whenever I need it. I'll cut the ears and the ducks out of a piece that's probably about the same thickness as the orange wood. These sections blend together, but it doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to end up sanding this whole project anyway when we get to the end. Since those are prominent pieces of the artwork, I think it'll look better to have a piece there versus a void. There still may be some areas that I omit and simply use shadow, so we'll end up doing a combo for this whole thing. As I said, ebony is expensive. Fortunately, I don't typically use a lot of it in my projects. It really depends on the artwork. When I buy materials, I like to look for small boards, like pin blanks. They're usually just big enough for the typical sizes of my pieces. Another option is you could use knife scales because they're typically a little bit wider. Looking pretty good. The dog and the ducks are pretty much done. So now I need to switch over to something else. I'm gonna go with green, which is lignum vitae. Now I'm just gonna focus on the duck heads for right now. The grass, I wanna do that towards the end. I wanna get all the other pieces in first. Now, lignum vitae is one of my favorite woods. I love this stuff, but it is insanely dense. It's one of the hardest woods, if not the hardest wood in the world, and it's oily too. So I'm gonna switch over to a more aggressive blade. So I'll use like a reverse tooth blade because a crown tooth blade will simply gum up quickly and I'll burn through too many of them. Now what's really cool about lignum vitae is it may look pale whenever you first mill it down, but it'll darken, get greener and greener, like a really cool rich green color whenever it's exposed to more UV light. Now if the board's just not quite green enough for you, you can always put it next to a window, let it soak up some of those rays, and it'll get darker and darker. It's pretty awesome. Here's the downside though. I'm in Michigan, and it's wintertime, so it's not very bright outside. So I'm gonna try to cheat. I'm gonna put some pieces underneath the lamp. Now this would be better if I actually used a lamp that had a UV bulb in it, like a black light or something. I don't really have one of those. I don't feel like I want to buy one. The thing is these things would darken up if I just set them in the shop for a long time, so the lamp doesn't hurt, so I'll just let them bake for a bit. I'll take what I can get. We can see the differences in our pieces after a few days. Here's what the bottom of it looks like that wasn't exposed to any light. Here's what the top face looks like that had the light shining on it. It'll get even darker over time also, but these look good enough for me to glue them into place now. I'll probably have to lightly sand these later on too, and that's fine as long as I don't remove too much material. If I do sand too much, then oh well, I just have to wait until they darken up again. Unless I use a UV protective finish, they're gonna darken even after I apply a finish to this project. However, it does slow it down. So if I want the project to look great right off the bat, then I'll let it darken before I apply the finish. I pretty much have the dog and the ducks done with the exception of the white areas, and that's something I'm gonna do towards the end, if not just dead last. I still have to sand this, and the problem is if you start putting pieces that are light colored, maybe like holly or something like that, like the really white stuff in there, it's gonna stain from the sawdust of all the colorful woods, and that just ruins the whole thing. So instead, I'm gonna switch things up. I'm gonna go with the tree. Now the tree is red, so I've got some different pieces of bloodwood, and I'm thinking, it's in the background, right? So it doesn't need to be as thick as the dog or the ducks, but it needs to be thicker than the background itself. I can take some of my offcuts and put it next to this piece and see how it does. And I see that in this case, this one's thinner than the orange wood that I have, but if I take an offcut from the background that I cut out, like this little piece of tree, I can see that it's thicker than that. So that's gonna work out fine. I'll use spray adhesive to stick the template onto the workpiece and then start cutting. And I'm still going to use an aggressive blade for this one because bloodwood is really oily. So even though this wood is thinner than the other stuff I was cutting, it'll still gum up those crown tooth blades pretty quickly. This is going to be an exercise of patience. I'm just cutting the perimeter around and there's a lot of squares. There's a lot of sharp corners. So it's cut this angle, switch it over, cut that angle. Maybe cut multiple lines on this side, rotate it 90 degrees, cut multiple lines on that other side. It's going to take time, but it'll be worth it in the end. I like that the tree has some mossy spots that go up the bark. Well, each one of those is inside the tree, so I don't have any access point, which means I need to drill a bunch of pilot holes and make those cuts out individually. So I've got a little hand drill here with a ultra tiny drill bit to it. These drill bits are pretty awesome. I like them. The thing is they break off easily. If you're using like a power drill or a Dremel or something, they'll easily snap off. So hand drill works out great. So I'm gonna drill out each one of these pilot holes, and they should only take a second or two for each one of them, but there's quite a bit of them, and then start cutting them out. So I'll feed the blade through the pilot hole, lock it down, latch the lever, the whole thing, and I'll cut out that little square or rectangle, depends on the size of it, and then unlatch it, remove the piece, feed it through the next pilot hole, and move on, and go section after section after section. It's a slow process, but I'm getting used to it, and I'm starting to work faster as I progress through the project. I need to cut out the leaves of the trees. Now, green is one of the hardest colors to pull off, and this artwork has multiple shades of it. Whatever I use for the tree, I also need to use for the grass and the bush. I'm gonna try something a little bit different. I'm gonna use white limba. I have a board that has a tan greenish undertone to it. I'm hoping that we can create an optical illusion in which the limba looks a little bit more green than tan because it's right next to the green lignum vitae pieces that I'm going to use for the darker shaded areas of the leaves. I could try to use a couple different pieces of lignum vitae, maybe a darker piece, a lighter piece, but I think ultimately it'll all darken and then kind of blend together and it won't give me the look I'm going for. At first I tried to get a perfect fit between the light and the dark green pieces, but then I changed tactics and I decided to cut them out quicker. Instead of concentrating so hard to get those pieces to fit right, I actually like it where there's some gaps in between the pieces. There's some lines in between them. It emphasizes the pixel look and it adds a little bit more shadow and depth between the leaves. There's usually a lot of space between leaves, so this could work out really well. Now I may try to get a tighter fit in some of the other sections of the artwork, like the grass and the bush. All right, I'm digging the tree. Looks like we made some pretty good choices when it came to the wood colors. So now I need to make the last object for the project before the giant elephant in the room. We'll deal with the giant elephant later. That is the bush. Gotta make the bush. And we got two colors here, right? We got light green and dark green. I'm gonna use the same wood species that I used before. White limba for the light green areas and lignum vitae for the darker shaded green sections. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like the bush has a lot more tiny pixels, or at least a lot more 90-degree angles. I used the number 5 for the tree leaves and ended up breaking a couple of the thinner areas. I fixed them so no one will notice. I'll move to a smaller blade and that should help a bit, at least for the limba. I can't go smaller with the lignum vitae. It's just too oily for my smaller blades, so I might have to roll with what I was using earlier. It's time for that elephant, the biggest section, the grass. Now I look at it, I'm seeing 3 colors. We got light green, we got dark green, and we have white. There's also a lot of little pieces to cut out. If I want to be lazy and get this project done quickly, I could simply take my board, slap the template on it, and go to work. But I would kick myself because then I'd be losing out on a really good opportunity, which is using the grain to our advantage. Instead, what I'm going to do is, instead of putting the template on here and cutting it out, I'm going to turn the board sideways or up and down, turn it 90 degrees. Just by rotating the board, we can see how the grain completely changes things. Now you've got the texture of the grain, the darker colors. It looks like grass. It's going to give it a really cool look and be more realistic. There is a downside though. I need a really wide board for this one. So I'm going to take my board, chop it up into pieces, and then glue them side by side. I'll end up with a really short but crazy wide board. I'll try to match up the grain as best as possible so it blends from one board into the next, but you know, hey, as best as I can because we're gluing a lot of sections together and it's not going to be perfect. The board will have to be sanded after the glue dries. I'll run it through my drum sander sideways. Typically you would sand a board from end to end. That way any sanding marks or scuffs are going to be with the grain. I'll do this sideways, but then I'll hit it with the orbital sander and get rid of any sanding marks and scratches. White limba is pretty soft, so I'm going to try to use a crown tooth blade. Since I'm cutting a lot of straight lines, I'm going to go with the number 5. The bigger the blade, the easier it is to cut straight. However, if I feel like I'm not getting into the tight spaces like I need, I'll drop down to a number 3 or a number 2. After I finish up the light color grass, then I'll start working on the darker green sections. Most of these are just a lot of little zigzag pieces. I try to use wood glue as much as possible with my projects, but when I have a lot of really small pieces like this one, I might use CA glue instead for some of these because it's just going to be a lot faster. I finished up all the colors, now it's time for Holly. Well, actually it's time for sanding, then it'll be time for Holly. I want to sand this project as much as possible before I actually put in all that white Holly to it because it could potentially stain. So what I'm going to do is hit this whole thing with some sandpaper and some files, clean it all up, vacuum up the dust, wipe it down with mineral spirits. Then I can work on the Holly. I'll probably have to do some sanding later on, but at least the bulk of the project will be taken care of. I jumped into the Holly, which are the highlights for the grass. And this took me a long time. Too long. There are so many tiny pieces. In hindsight, I probably could have modified the design a bit, maybe made these pieces so that there weren't so many of them, or enlarged them a bit. I want the dog's snout and the duck's eyes to stick out much higher than the rest of the pieces. I'm just not sure how much higher. So I'm going to cut these out of a fairly thick piece of Holly. I'll also cut out the nose and the pupils out of ebony. I'll glue the Holly and the ebony together to make one big piece, then put that into the artwork. Once the glue dries, I'll come back and use a file or some sandpaper and basically make it thinner until it looks right. Things look good. The whole project's glued together, it's all sanded, cleaned up. So now I'm just gonna let it sit for a bit. I want to darken up a little bit more, especially the dog and some of those greener areas, so I'm gonna let it sit for a couple days. Then I can come back and apply finish. Now for finish, I'm gonna go with spraying it with some clear matte lacquer. I'll probably apply 3-4 coats, wait a few minutes between each coat. This type of finish is really fast to apply, so I like it. Also like how it doesn't really mess with the colors too much. It doesn't oversaturate the colors, which could happen whenever you're using different types of woods, like woods that have red and yellow, compared to something like maple, where it's just more neutral. Hey, look at that, we made a scroll saw project inspired by a video game. I don't typically like shiny finishes, so I'm digging the matte sheen with this one. I think it helps keep the background neutral while letting the other colors stand out. And speaking of the background, I think the horizontal grain looks kind of like wind, adding a subtle detail to the art. The dog's the star of the show, but I think there's some visual interest scattered throughout the entire project. I like the ducks that are up in the sky. I think those might be my favorite part. I made their eyes a bit more pronounced, giving it a little bit of silliness. The tree took a lot more time than really what I wanted due to all the intricate cuts, but that was nothing compared to the bush and the grass. Wow, I bit off a lot with that section. I conducted a poll on Patreon, put some artwork up and said, what should I make? They voted for me to make the chimp in a hoodie project. I love that one. This one finished second place. So hey, might as well make this one too. I like how it turned out, so thank you for your support and all your ideas. And to meet again, get in your shop and build something awesome.